Picture this, June 1839. You're Lin Zexu, a Chinese official, standing on a beach in Guangzhou. In front of you, 1,400 tons of British opium, enough drugs to destroy an empire. For years, Britain has been flooding China with this poison. Millions are addicted. Your economy is hemorrhaging silver, your civilization is dying. So you burn it all, every chest, every ounce. You write to Queen Victoria, "Would you allow opium to be sold in London? Then why do you force it upon us?" Her response doesn't come in words. It comes in warships. 1 year later, British gunboats are obliterating Chinese defenses. Steam-powered warships with explosive shells versus wooden junks with cannons from the 1600s. It's not a war, it's a slaughter. This begins what China calls the Century of Humiliation. 100 years where the greatest civilization on Earth is invaded, carved up, and colonized by every major power. But here's what makes this story unbelievable. China survives. More than survives. China rises again. From the poorest nation on Earth to global superpower challenging America itself. In less than a century. This is the greatest comeback in modern history. And how they did it will blow your mind. Before we dive in, if you want to understand the real stories behind how nations rise and fall, the history that actually explains our world today, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Here's what most people don't know. For most of human history, China was the superpower. Largest economy, most advanced technology, most sophisticated government. In 1820, China's GDP was larger than all of Europe combined. Then in just 30 years, everything collapsed. Opium Wars, foreign invasions, civil wars, famine, occupation. China went from the richest nation on Earth to one of the poorest, from the most powerful to the most humiliated. But the Chinese never forgot who they were, and that memory became fuel for the greatest revival in history. This is how they did it. To understand the fall, you need to understand what China was. By 1800, the Qing Dynasty had ruled for 150 years. China was completely self-sufficient. They produced everything they needed: silk, porcelain, tea, rice, gunpowder. They invented paper money while Europe was still using coins. The Chinese called their empire the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, and they had the proof. They were the most advanced civilization on Earth. When European traders showed up begging to do business, the Chinese weren't impressed. What could these barbarians possibly offer that China didn't already have? The answer turned out to be poison. By the 1800s, Britain had a massive problem. They were buying incredible amounts of Chinese tea and silk, but China didn't want anything Britain made. The trade deficit was bleeding Britain's silver reserves dry, so the British came up with a solution that was economically brilliant and morally catastrophic: sell opium to China. They grew it in British-controlled India, smuggled it into China through corrupt officials, then used the profits to buy Chinese goods. By the 1830s, the strategy was working perfectly. For Britain. For China, it was a nightmare. Millions of Chinese were addicted. Silver was pouring out of the country to pay for drugs. The economy was collapsing from within. The Qing government tried to stop it, but too many officials were getting rich from the trade. Then came Lin Zexu. And the moment that changed everything. Britain's response was immediate and overwhelming. But this wasn't really a war. It was a demonstration of just how far China had fallen behind the West technologically. British warships were steam-powered, iron-hulled monsters armed with explosive shells that could blow through Chinese defenses like paper. Chinese war junks were still wooden sailing ships with outdated cannons that could barely fire accurately. British infantry carried rifles that could hit a target at 300 yards. Chinese soldiers were still using matchlock muskets from the 1600s that misfired half the time. The British systematically destroyed every Chinese coastal defense. They sailed their warships up rivers deep into the country, blockading major ports and threatening Beijing itself. In 1842, China had no choice but to surrender. The Treaty of Nanking was absolutely humiliating. Hong Kong given to Britain permanently, 5 major ports forced open to foreign trade, China ordered to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations. And here's the kicker. British citizens in China would only answer to British law, not Chinese law. China had just become a semi-colony in its own country. It was the first of what became known as the unequal treaties. And it was just the beginning. 14 years later, in 1856, Britain and France decided they wanted more. They launched another war, and once again, China lost catastrophically. In 1860, British and French forces marched straight into Beijing. They found the old Summer Palace, one of the wonders of the ancient world, filled with treasures and art accumulated over thousands of years. They spent 3 days looting it, then they burned it to the ground. It was deliberate cultural terrorism designed to break China's spirit, and it worked. The Treaty of Tientsin forced China to legalize the opium trade, open even more ports, allow foreign ambassadors in Beijing, give up more territory, and pay even more crushing reparations. China was being carved up like a prize turkey. but the external invasions were nothing compared to what was happening inside the country. While the Opium Wars were destroying China's coast, an internal catastrophe erupted that most people have never even heard of. A man named Hong Xiuquan, who had failed the civil service exam multiple times, started having visions. He became convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, destined to overthrow the Qing Dynasty and establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. It sounds completely insane, but he attracted millions of followers, peasants who were furious at Qing corruption, foreign humiliation, and crushing poverty. By 1853, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled huge parts of southern China. They captured Nanjing and made it their capital. At their peak, they governed 30 million people. The Taiping Rebellion lasted 14 years. And here's the number that should shock you. The death toll was somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. That's more than World War I. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the deadliest wars in human history, and almost nobody outside of China has even heard of it. The Qing eventually crushed the rebellion with help from Western mercenaries. But China was absolutely devastated. Entire provinces were depopulated. The economy was in ruins, and the vultures were circling. By the 1890s, every major power on Earth wanted a piece of China. Britain took more territory around Hong Kong and dominated Chinese trade. France seized Vietnam, which had been a Chinese tributary state, and carved out zones of influence in southern China. Russia grabbed massive territories in the north, what's now Manchuria and parts of Central Asia. Germany demanded ports in Shandong province. And then Japan, which had only recently modernized itself, shocked everyone by completely destroying the Chinese military in 1895. They took Taiwan and Korea and announced to the world that the age of Chinese dominance in Asia was over. Even the United States got in on the action, demanding an open-door policy to make sure American merchants could access Chinese markets. China wasn't being colonized like Africa or India. Instead, it was being divided into spheres of influence, zones where different foreign powers controlled the economy, the resources, and effectively the local governments. The Qing Dynasty still technically ruled, but everyone knew the emperor was just a puppet. The Middle Kingdom, the center of the world for thousands of years, had become a plaything for foreign empires. By 1899, Chinese rage finally exploded. A movement called the Boxers, named because they practiced martial arts, rose up in northern China. Their slogan was simple: support the Qing, destroy the foreigners. They attacked foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians who had converted, and foreign-owned businesses. They laid siege to the foreign embassy quarter in Beijing. The Qing government, desperate and weak, secretly supported them. The foreign response was swift and overwhelming. An eight-nation alliance, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and the United States, sent 20,000 professional troops to China. They crushed the Boxers in weeks, occupied Beijing, looted the Forbidden City, and then they presented China with a bill: 450 million taels of silver in reparations. That's equivalent to billions of dollars today. It would take China decades to pay it off. The Qing Dynasty was finished. It was just a matter of time. In October 1911, a military uprising in the city of Wuhan sparked a revolution that spread like wildfire. Province after province declared independence from the Qing. By February 1912, the last emperor, a 6-year-old child named Puyi, was forced to give up the throne. The Qing Dynasty, which had ruled since 1644, was over. More than that, the entire imperial system that had governed China for over 2,000 years was dead. A republic was declared. But there was one massive problem. China had absolutely no experience with democracy. No strong institutions, no unified military, no real plan. What followed was complete chaos. By 1916, China had fractured into dozens of regions controlled by warlords. These weren't ideological leaders with grand visions. They were military strongmen with private armies who taxed their regions into poverty and fought each other in endless petty wars. Beijing technically had a government, but it controlled almost nothing beyond the capital city itself. Some warlords allied with foreign powers. Some printed their own currency. China, the oldest continuous civilization on planet Earth, had ceased to exist as a unified state. It was the absolute lowest point in 3,000 years of Chinese history. But two movements were forming in the shadows, and their rivalry would define the next 100 years. The nationalists, the Kuomintang, were led by Chiang Kai-shek after the death of their founder, Sun Yat-sen. They wanted a modern, unified China based on nationalism, democracy, and capitalism. They were backed by Chinese business elites and eventually by the United States. The Communists, founded in 1921, were led by a revolutionary named Mao Zedong. They wanted a peasant revolution, total land redistribution, and a communist state. They were backed by the Soviet Union. At first, these two groups actually cooperated. From 1923 to 1927, the nationalists and communists worked together to defeat the warlords and reunify China, and it worked. By 1928, Chiang Kai-shek had nominally unified China under nationalist control, Then he turned on the communists. In April 1927, Chiang ordered a purge. Nationalist forces massacred Communist Party members in Shanghai and other cities. Thousands were killed. The Chinese Civil War had begun. By 1934, the nationalists had the communists completely surrounded in southern China. The Communist Party was on the verge of total extinction, so they did something desperate. They retreated. 86,000 communists broke through nationalist lines and began marching. On foot, over 6,000 miles. Across some of the most brutal terrain in China, they crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. They were constantly under attack from nationalist forces. They faced starvation, disease, and freezing temperatures. By the time they reached northern China, only about 8,000 had survived. But those 8,000 survivors included Mao Zedong, who emerged from the Long March as the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. The Long March became a founding myth of Chinese communism, proof of their resilience, their sacrifice, their destiny to lead China. But both the nationalists and the communists were about to face a much bigger enemy, and this enemy would unite them, at least temporarily. On July 7, 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Japan had been nibbling away at Chinese territory since 1931 when they seized Manchuria. Now they wanted the whole country. The invasion was absolutely brutal. In December 1937, Japanese forces captured Nanjing, the nationalist capital. What happened next became known as the Rape of Nanjing. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers carried out mass killings and violence. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were killed. The nationalists and communists formed a temporary alliance against Japan, but they barely actually cooperated. Both sides were fighting Japan, while simultaneously positioning themselves for the civil war they knew would resume the moment Japan was defeated. The 8 years of Japanese occupation were catastrophic for China. Between 15 and 20 million Chinese died. Entire cities were destroyed. The economy collapsed completely. Famine killed millions more. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombs, China was in absolute ruins. And immediately, within weeks, the Chinese Civil War resumed with even greater intensity. After World War II ended, everyone expected the nationalists to win easily. They had every advantage. 4 million troops compared to only 1 million communists. Modern weapons supplied by the United States. Control of all major cities and industrial centers. International recognition as China's legitimate government. The communists had peasant support in the countryside, guerrilla warfare experience, ideological commitment, and limited help from the Soviet Union. But Chiang Kai-shek made catastrophic mistakes. His government was incredibly corrupt. Hyperinflation destroyed the economy. In some cities, prices increased by 3 million%. Nationalist soldiers started defecting or simply refusing to fight. Urban populations, who had initially supported the nationalists, turned against them in disgust. Meanwhile, Mao's communists were disciplined. They promised land reform to peasants. Communist soldiers were ordered to treat civilians well, pay for food, and respect local customs. They were winning hearts and minds while the nationalists were losing them. By 1949, the nationalist position had completely collapsed. Chiang Kai-shek and about 2 million supporters fled to the island of Taiwan, where they claimed to still be the legitimate government of all China. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in front of hundreds of thousands of people and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up. The People's Republic of China was born." For the first time since the Opium Wars began 110 years earlier, China had a strong, unified government that didn't answer to any foreign power. The Century of Humiliation was officially over, but the recovery was going to be anything but smooth. Mao faced an almost impossible task. China was one of the poorest countries on earth. The economy had been destroyed by a century of continuous warfare. 90% of the population was rural and lived in crushing poverty. Industry barely existed. Mao's first moves were decisive. From 1950 to 1952, the communists implemented land reform. They seized land from landlords and redistributed it to poor peasants. It was incredibly popular with the rural masses, but it was also violent. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million landlords were killed. Then came the first 5-year plan from 1953 to 1957, modeled on Soviet central planning. China focused entirely on heavy industry, steel production, coal mining, infrastructure. It actually worked pretty well initially. Industrial output grew significantly, but then Mao made one of the single greatest mistakes in human history. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward. The idea was to rapidly industrialize China through mass mobilization. Peasants were organized into massive communes. They were told to produce steel in backyard furnaces. Agricultural work was neglected, so everyone could focus on industrial production. It was an absolute disaster. The backyard furnaces produced completely useless, low-quality steel. Agricultural production collapsed. And here's the thing that made it even worse. Local Communist Party officials were terrified to report the failures to their superiors, so they lied about harvest yields. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, the single deadliest famine in all of human history. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 and 45 million Chinese people starved to death. People ate tree bark. They ate grass. There are documented cases of cannibalism. It was entirely man-made, caused by Mao's delusional policies and a political system where no one could challenge him or tell him the truth. Mao was forced to step back from day-to-day governance. More moderate leaders like Deng Xiaoping took over and began implementing pragmatic economic reforms. Agricultural production recovered. The economy stabilized. But Mao wasn't done, not even close. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Officially, it was supposed to purge capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. But really, it was Mao's attempt to regain absolute power from the moderate leaders who had sidelined him. Mao mobilized Chinese youth into groups called the Red Guards. These were fanatical teenagers who worshipped Mao like a god. They were given permission to attack anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary. What followed was complete madness. Red Guards attacked intellectuals, teachers, and anyone they considered bourgeois. They destroyed ancient temples, burned priceless books and art, and smashed cultural artifacts that had survived for thousands of years. They forced millions of people into brutal labor camps. They tortured and killed so-called counter-revolutionaries. It was mass hysteria on a national scale. Children denounced their own parents. Students beat their teachers to death. The entire country descended into chaos. The economy stagnated. Education basically stopped. Scientists and engineers were sent to work on pig farms. Between 1 and 2 million people died during the Cultural Revolution. Tens of millions more were persecuted, tortured, or had their lives destroyed. The madness ended only when Mao finally died in September 1976. China had survived. Barely. The Communist Party was still in power, but China was still desperately poor, traumatized, and isolated from the world. Then came a man who would change absolutely everything, and his approach would be the exact opposite of Mao's. In 1978, a 74-year-old Communist Party veteran named Deng Xiaoping consolidated power. Deng had been purged twice during the Cultural Revolution. He had seen Mao's catastrophic failures up close, and he had learned from them. Deng's philosophy was brilliantly simple. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Ideology doesn't matter. Results matter. If capitalism works better than communism, then use capitalism. In December 1978, Deng launched what he called reform and opening up. It would become the most successful economic transformation in human history. Deng focused on 4 key areas he called the 4 modernizations. Agriculture. Farmers were allowed to sell their surplus crops for personal profit. Industry. State-owned enterprises were given more autonomy, and private businesses were actually allowed to exist. Science and technology. Chinese students were sent abroad to study, and foreign experts were invited into China. National defense. The military was modernized with new equipment and training. The results were absolutely stunning. In 1978, China's GDP per capita was just $156. That made China poorer than most countries in Africa. By the year 2000, it had jumped to $950, a 6-fold increase in just 22 years. By 2020, China's GDP per capita was over $10,000. That's a 64-fold increase since Deng's reforms began. To put that in perspective, China lifted more people out of poverty faster than any nation in history. Over 800 million people. That's more than the entire population of Europe. Deng created something called special economic zones. These were specific areas where capitalist economic policies were allowed as experiments. The most famous was Shenzhen, right next to Hong Kong. In 1980, Shenzhen was a fishing village of about 30,000 people. By 2020, it was a gleaming megacity of over 12 million people. Skyscrapers, high-tech companies, a GDP larger than entire countries. Foreign companies were invited to invest in China. In exchange for access to the massive Chinese market, they were required to share their technology. Chinese workers learned modern manufacturing techniques. China became known as the world's factory. China's rise wasn't an accident, it was strategic. First, attract massive foreign investment by offering cheap labor and potential market access. Second, force technology transfer so foreign companies had to share their knowledge. Third, copy and improve on that technology through Chinese innovation. Fourth, invest absolutely massive amounts in infrastructure. Roads, railways, ports, airports, entire new cities. Fifth, educate the population, sending millions of students to universities, especially in science and engineering. Sixth, become so essential to global supply chains that the world economy depends on you. It worked brilliantly. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, integrating fully into the global economy. By 2010, China had surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy. By 2014, measured by some metrics, China had actually become the world's largest economy. But success creates new problems. By the 2010s, China was facing serious tensions. How do you maintain Communist Party political control while running an increasingly capitalist economy? Can that contradiction last forever? There was massive inequality. Coastal cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen were incredibly wealthy, but interior provinces were still poor. The wealth gap was enormous. Environmental destruction was catastrophic. Rapid industrialization had created some of the worst air and water pollution on the planet. Corruption was rampant. Economic growth had created opportunities for party officials to steal billions. And internationally, as China grew more powerful, tensions with the United States started rising dramatically. In 2012, Xi Jinping became China's leader, and he has consolidated more personal power than any Chinese leader since Mao. Xi eliminated presidential term limits, making himself potentially president for life. He centralized decision-making. He cracked down hard on dissent and tightened control over society. He asserted Chinese nationalism more aggressively than any leader in decades. And he launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion plan to build infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe, creating a Chinese-centered global economic network. Xi's message is absolutely clear. The century of humiliation is over. China is strong again, and China will never, ever be weak again. Let's put this transformation in perspective with just numbers. In 1949, when the communists took power, China's total GDP was about $123 billion in today's dollars. The United States' GDP was $1.8 trillion. China was nowhere close. In 2023, China's GDP is over $17 trillion. The United States is at about $25 trillion. China has become the world's second largest economy and is closing the gap. China went from being one of the absolute poorest nations on Earth to a global superpower in just 70 years. How did they do it? They unified the country after decades of warlord chaos and civil war. They maintained absolute sovereignty, refusing to be controlled by any foreign power ever again. They abandoned pure communist ideology when it didn't work and pragmatically adopted what did work. They invested massive amounts in education, infrastructure, and technology. They played the long game, planning in decades, while other countries planned in election cycles. And they used the memory of the Century of Humiliation as fuel, as motivation to never be weak again. But China's rise creates questions that nobody can answer yet. Can a one-party authoritarian state coexist permanently with a market economy? Can China truly innovate at the cutting edge of technology? Or can they only copy and improve what others invent? Will China's rise lead to military conflict with the United States? Or can two superpowers somehow coexist peacefully? Can China overcome what economists call the middle-income trap that stops most developing countries from becoming truly wealthy? And how will China's rapidly aging population affect its economic future? We don't know the answers yet. History is still being written in real time, but China's revival teaches us some powerful lessons. Nations can recover from almost anything. China was as low as a nation can possibly go. They came back. Long-term strategic thinking matters. Chinese leaders plan in decades and generations, not election cycles. National humiliation is one of the most powerful motivators in politics. The memory of those 110 years drives Chinese policy even today. Pragmatism beats ideology. Deng abandoned communist economic purity for whatever worked. It paid off massively, and history shapes the present in ways we often don't realize. You cannot understand modern China, its policies, its ambitions, its fears, without understanding the Opium Wars, the warlords, the Japanese invasion, Mao's catastrophes, and Deng's resurrection. From 1839 to 1949, for 110 years, China experienced the absolute worst century in its entire 3,000-year history. Opium addiction, foreign invasion, civil wars, famine, occupation, the complete collapse of the imperial system. The Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, became a plaything for foreign empires. But China survived. And then China rose again. Today, China is a superpower challenging American dominance. It's the world's largest economy by some measures, a technological leader, a global power that shapes events on every continent. The question now isn't, can China rise? That question has been answered. The question is, what will China do with that power? How will it use its strength? Will it be a force for stability or disruption? Will it cooperate with the existing world order or try to overturn it? The century of humiliation is over. The century of Chinese strength has begun. And how China navigates this new era will shape the entire 21st century for every person on this planet. If you want more stories about how nations fall and rise again, the history that explains the world we're living in right now, subscribe and hit the bell. Drop a comment. What nation's comeback should I cover next? Germany after World War II? Japan's economic miracle? India after independence? Until next time, remember this. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping our future right now. And China's revival? It's one of the most important stories of our time. The question isn't whether China has risen. The question is whether the world is ready for what comes next.